of the word hood, I think of a person, a place, and perhaps even a thing. I'm Sir Creepsta, and welcome to Muhlenberg County Ghost Stories from the Hood. Tonight's tale of terror is entitled Angel of Death, the Hospital Nurse. When one usually thinks of hospitals, the first thing that comes to mind is that it's a place where the sick go to in hopes of getting medical attention to take care of whatever problems they might be dealing with at that time. A place where life begins. But one should also be aware that it can be a place where one could possibly spend their last few hours here on Earth before crossing over to the other side. Tonight's tale of terror happens to be a story dealing with the latter. So sit back, relax, grab some snacks, and be entertained by yet another Muhlenberg County ghost story from the Hood. It was around the year 2002. At that time, my sister worked as a receptionist at the Muhlenberg County Hospital located in Greenville, Kentucky. She was a highly motivated, career-driven mother of two boys who would spend 3 days out of the week making the roughly 3-hour plus round-trip drive to Murray State University, located in Murray, Kentucky. All along working 5 days a week at the local hospital located in Greenville. She would often tell me that the hours at her job were mostly long and boring, and that it was often a challenge for her to try and stay awake during her long shift. But because of her desire to provide for herself as well as her two boys, she made the best of her situation regardless of its challenges. As far as her job was concerned, she told me that there were times when there will be both the feeling of joy and excitement on the floor, especially when a family's loved one had recovered from whatever illness that kept them there for their long, lengthy stay. And then they got the pleasure of being discharged from the hospital. But she went on to tell me that this momentary feeling of joy and excitement for the families would more often than not be overshadowed whenever she felt the pain in her heart for the families that had to deal with the loss of a loved one. On these particular nights, she told me that time seemed to drag its behind, feeling as if the night would never end. According to my sister, on one particular night, while sitting at her station, barely awake after a long day of class in Mary, driving home, feeding her kids, and then going straight into work, she suddenly felt as if the temperature in the hospital dropped 20 degrees, causing chills to go over her frail body. This immediately caused her to wake up. As she rubbed her eyes, she looked up at the clock to see the time. And at that moment, she noticed what appeared to her a nurse heading down the hallway. But before she could fully acknowledge who the nurse was, the hallway lights began to flicker on and off. My sister would then tell me that no matter how hard she tried to identify the nurse, it just didn't appear to have been any of the nurses that she had come to know by working the graveyard shift. Reason being was because of the obvious outdated vintage uniform that the nurse was wearing at the time. She told me that the nurse continued to walk down the hallway, periodically turning around and glancing back in her direction. And then she saw her turn and enter into one of the patient's rooms that was located at that part of the hospital. Not long after the mystery nurse had entered into the room, the alarm went off, signaling code red for that patient's room. And soon after, the rest of the staff of nurses on call that night fled to the room, seeking to administer medical attention to that patient. After the staff had been in the room for about 20 minutes or so, My sister told me that she had continued to look in that direction, and then she started to see the staff slowly exit the room. That was all of them except for the first nurse that had entered the room wearing the outdated uniform. Soon after, she told me that one of the nurses, who happened to be a close friend of hers, approached her, telling her that the patient in the room didn't make it. Upon hearing this news about the patient, she became both heartbroken and scared at the same time because of what she had just went through with the sudden drop in temperature and the unidentified nurse wearing the outdated uniform entering into the room but not coming out of the room with the rest of the staff. Upon hearing this from my sister, her friend had a confused look upon her face and then asked my sister what in the world was she talking about, telling her that there wasn't anyone else in the patient's room other than herself, another nurse, and the residing doctor that was on call that night. By now, my sister was going to tell me that her nerves were completely shot from all that she'd witnessed earlier. She then went on to tell me that while her and her friend were discussing this matter, one of the older head nurses that was about to come on for the morning shift happened to hear her and the two of them talking about the nurse in the outdated uniform. The older nurse then approached them and began telling them that the nurse my sister saw was the ghost of Nurse Betty, the death angel, and that she had allegedly been roaming the hospital floors for years, and that usually when she's spotted by a staff member entering into a patient's room, soon after that patient died. At that moment, my sister would tell me she knew that she probably wouldn't be working at this hospital for long, especially seeing that this wasn't her first but second incident she had dealing with the strange and unusual behavior as well as sightings at this hospital. The first being, according to her and her friend the nurse, the alleged exorcism of a man who had been brought to the hospital with complaints of perhaps being possessed by something that was trying its best to rip out of its body. The situation allegedly got so bad that a priest was called to the hospital to try and exorcise the demon that was possessing the man. On this particular night, according to my sister, several nurses, the doctor, as well as the priest all entered into the patient's room and started administering aid for several hours to this out-of-control patient. Afterwards, according to my sister, the whole incident was swept under the rug and kept hush-hush amongst the staff and all that witnessed it. Soon after that night of horror, my sister would quit working at the hospital and get herself a day job working at a rehabilitation clinic in Madisonville, Kentucky. But she would also go on to tell me that there's not a doubt in her mind that Nurse Betty, the infamous Angel of Death, still roams the hallways of the new Orangewood Health Facility in Greenville, just waiting on some poor soul about to cross over to the other side. So, if you're ever at the Monroe County Orangewood Health Facility, late night or early morning, whether as a patient or a visitor, beware if you happen to see a nurse roaming its hallways dressed in an apparently outdated uniform, and pray that she doesn't enter into yours or a loved one's room, for it just might be old Nurse Betty coming to collect yet another soul. I'm Sir Creepsta, and until next time, stay terrified.